The forest in Oregon does not begin with trees. It begins with silence. The kind of silence that feels older than language, older than roads, older than the idea that a man can own land simply because he cut it first. And as I crossed the state line 15 years after my brother disappeared, I realized that I had never really left this place, because some part of me had remained here, caught between the damp air and the memory of a day that never properly ended. I told everyone that I was returning to film a documentary about the legend of Bigfoot, about sightings and folklore, and the psychology of isolation. But that was a lie shaped like a project proposal. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. I came back because my brother Daniel vanished in these woods, officially declared a victim of a bear attack, unofficially reduced to a cautionary tale told by park rangers to keep tourists on marked trails. And I never believed it. Not because I thought something mythical took him, but because I knew him. And Daniel was not reckless. He did not wander blindly into darkness. He studied maps. He marked coordinates. He respected boundaries. And the last voicemail he left me was not the voice of a man surprised by a charging animal. It was the voice of someone who had found something he did not yet understand. As the highway narrowed into a 2-lane road swallowed by fir and cedar, I turned off the radio and listened to the tires hum against wet asphalt. The trees rose on both sides like walls, thick with moss that hung from branches in long green veils. And the deeper I drove, the more the world behind me seemed unreal. Cities felt theoretical, noise felt distant. Even time itself seemed to slow under the weight of the canopy. This part of Oregon was once the center of a logging dispute, old-growth forest cut in sections that environmental groups fought to protect. My father worked for one of the companies contracted to survey timber value in those years. A fact I used to mention with pride when I was younger, before I understood what it meant to measure a living thing in board feet, before I learned that some of those surveys led directly into areas locals called closed ground, places hunters avoided, and where, according to Daniel's notes, the trees grew in unnatural patterns. When I finally turned onto the abandoned logging road that would take me close to where he vanished, gravel crackled under the tires, and the forest closed tighter. The air here smelled of rain and rot and something mineral, as if the earth itself were slowly dissolving back into itself. I parked near a rusted sign half consumed by ivy. The letters almost unreadable, but still visible enough to make out a faded warning about restricted activity, the restriction no longer enforced, the land left to recover in silence. I stepped out of the car, and the first thing that struck me was the sound, or rather the absence of it. No birds calling overhead, no distant chainsaw, no wind pushing through branches, only the faint drip of water falling from leaf to leaf, each drop echoing louder than it should. I stood there longer than necessary, breathing in the damp cold and trying to convince myself that this was just a location, just coordinates on a map, not the last known place where my brother stood. Somewhere beyond the first line of trees lay the clearing where search teams found his backpack, torn open, his camera smashed, no blood, no body, just disturbance, as if something large had moved through without leaving the kind of evidence authorities prefer. I retrieved my own camera from the trunk, but did not turn it on yet. Some part of me felt that recording too soon would be disrespectful, as if the forest required acknowledgement before documentation. I walked a few steps past the road and into the undergrowth. boots sinking slightly into moss that felt almost sponge-like beneath my weight. And I remember Daniel describing this texture in one of his field journals. He wrote that the forest floor here did not feel like ground, but like something layered, something built over time, as if generations of fallen needles and leaves were protecting what lay beneath. I knelt and touched the moss with my bare hand. It was cold and alive, and strangely resilient, and I tried to imagine what he had seen that made his final message tremble. The official report claimed he likely startled a black bear during mating season, that the animal dragged him off, and scavengers scattered what remained, but no remains were ever recovered. No traceable DNA beyond what they attributed to common wildlife. And that absence always bothered me more than any confirmed violence would have. As I stood there, the memory of his voice returned uninvited. Not the words, just the tone, urgent, but not panicked, curious, but edged with something close to awe. I closed my eyes, and for a moment the years collapsed. I was no longer a man in his 30s with a production budget and a carefully constructed narrative. I was a younger brother, waiting for a call that never came. The wind shifted suddenly, a low current moving through the trees that caused the upper branches to sway, and with it came a faint knocking sound, soft, irregular, like wood tapping against wood. In the distance, I opened my eyes and scanned the tree line, telling myself it was nothing more than limbs brushing in the breeze. But the rhythm did not feel random. It came once, then silence, then again, deliberate, spaced, not loud enough to alarm, just enough to be noticed. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Because Daniel once mentioned a pattern he heard at night. 3 knocks carried through fog. He wrote that it was probably another researcher signaling a partner. Yet no other teams reported being in the area. The sound came again. This time slightly clearer, wood striking wood somewhere deeper in the forest. And I realized with a slow, creeping certainty that this was the first time in 15 years that I had heard something here with my own ears. Something that did not fit neatly into an explanation. I told myself not to romanticize it, not to let grief turn ordinary noise into myth. But standing there, beneath trees, older than any story we have written, it became impossible to ignore the feeling that I was not alone. Not in the dramatic sense of being hunted, but in the quieter sense of being acknowledged, as if the forest had registered my return and was deciding what to do with it. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. And in that silence I understood something I had not admitted even to myself. I had not come here to prove that legends were real. I had come to find out whether the forest had taken my brother, or whether we had taken something from it first. By the time the rest of the crew arrived, the light had already shifted into that muted gray that seems permanent beneath the canopy in this part of Oregon, as if the sun never fully commits to touching the ground. I watched their SUV crawl down the abandoned logging road, tires slipping slightly in wet gravel. And for a moment, I saw us the way an outsider might. A small group of people with cameras and equipment cases driving into a forest that had already erased heavier machinery and louder men. Ethan was the first to step out. Practical, skeptical, the kind of cinematographer who trusts lenses more than stories. He stretched, glanced at the trees, and said it felt quieter than he expected. I almost told him it had been quieter before they arrived, but I kept that to myself. Behind him came Lena, our sound engineer, more sensitive to atmosphere than she liked to admit. She stood still for a second, with her recorder bag over her shoulder, and whispered that the air felt thick, as if it was holding something back. We unloaded equipment in near silence, the usual jokes about remote shoots never fully forming. Even Ethan seemed restrained, glancing more than once toward the tree line as though measuring distances instinctively. We chose a small clearing just off the old road to set up camp, a place where moss-covered stumps marked what had once been a cluster of massive trees, their absence almost architectural, leaving a circular openness surrounded by towering firs. The ground was uneven but stable, and as we pitched tents, the smell of damp wood and earth intensified. I caught Lena brushing her hand across one of the stumps, tracing the rings, counting them quietly. She mouthed a number to herself, and then stopped when she realized how old the tree must have been when it was cut. Ethan unfolded the tripod and asked when we would start rolling. I told him at dusk that I wanted the first footage to capture the forest transitioning into night. It sounded cinematic when I said it, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to delay the moment when we formally announced our presence, because turning on a camera feels like declaring intention, and I was not sure this was a place where intentions went unnoticed. As the afternoon dimmed, we walked a short distance deeper into the woods to capture establishing shots. Fallen logs lay half swallowed by moss, their bark peeling away in long strips. And in several places I noticed younger trees growing directly from the decaying trunks. Life rising from death in a cycle so quiet it felt almost secretive. Ethan filmed the textures, the moisture clinging to needles, the way the fog drifted between trunks like breath, while I narrated loosely about regional sightings of Big Fut, about indigenous legends of forest guardians, and modern reports dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. My voice sounded steady, professional, but beneath it ran a second monologue I did not record. Memories of Daniel's handwriting in the margins of his notebooks, references to patterns in tree breaks that did not match storm damage, comments about 3 distinct knocks, heard after midnight on consecutive nights. At one point, Lena raised a hand to signal silence. We froze, listening. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, a hollow strike echoing through timber. Not close, not distant either. Ethan frowned and whispered that it could be woodpeckers. I nodded automatically, even though the rhythm was wrong, too spaced, too deliberate. We stood like that for nearly a minute, until the forest resumed its soft, ambient murmur. And whatever produced the sound ceased. Ethan shrugged it off and resumed filming, but Lena kept her recorder running longer than necessary, eyes fixed between 2 trees where the shadows seemed darker than the rest. When we returned to camp, the sky above the canopy had shifted from gray to a deepening blue, barely visible through the interlocking branches. We lit a small contained fire in a metal pit we brought with us, careful not to scorch the forest floor, and as flames flickered against trunks, the clearing felt temporarily ours, human, contained. Ethan finally relaxed enough to ask me directly why this location mattered so much. I gave him the prepared version, the cluster of sightings in this region, the historical logging conflict, the statistical anomaly of disappearances compared to similar terrain. He listened, but did not look convinced. Then he asked about my brother, not accusingly, just directly, and the fire cracked between us. As I admitted that Daniel vanished less than 5 miles from where we were sitting, Lena looked up sharply at that, clearly unaware of the proximity. I had not intended to reveal it so soon, but the words felt inevitable once spoken. Ethan leaned back and exhaled slowly, saying that changed things, that it meant we needed to be careful about objectivity. I agreed, though objectivity had never been the point for me. As darkness thickened, the forest transformed, the trunks around us losing detail and becoming vertical shadows, the spaces between them deepening into something almost liquid. Lena placed small audio recorders at the edge of the clearing, discrete devices meant to capture ambient nocturnal sound. She marked their positions on a tablet and returned to the fire. We kept conversation low, partly out of respect, partly because raising our voices felt intrusive, and for a while nothing happened beyond the normal sounds of night settling in. Distant insects, a branch adjusting under its own weight, the faint rush of wind high above. Then, sometime after full dark, when the fire had burned low and Ethan had retreated to his tent to review footage, it came again. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, clear enough this time that none of us could pretend it was random. Lena's head snapped toward the sound instantly, her training overriding fear as she reached for her handheld recorder. I remained still, counting the seconds between each strike, 1, 2, 3, the pauses identical, the tone resonant, as if something large had chosen a specific trunk to hit. Ethan emerged from his tent, whispering that he heard it too. We waited for a 4th, a 5th, something to confirm a pattern. But the forest returned to silence with unnerving discipline. I felt the old memory align with the present. Daniel's note about repeated knocks after midnight, his question scribbled in ink beneath it, signal or warning. Standing there with my crew, watching the darkness press closer to the edge of our small circle of light, I realized that whatever had made that sound did not feel threatened by us. It did not rush. It did not flee. It announced itself and then withdrew. And the most unsettling part was not the possibility that it was something unknown. It was the impression that it understood distance, timing, and restraint better than we did. Ethan finally muttered that we should get some rest and reassess in the morning. Lena collected the nearest recorder, but left the others in place, saying she wanted to see if the pattern repeated at the same interval later in the night. I agreed, though sleep felt unlikely. As I lay inside my tent, listening to the faint zipper hum in the breeze and the subtle shift of fabric, I stared into the darkness inches from my face and replayed the rhythm again and again. 3 deliberate knocks carried through timber that had witnessed centuries. And somewhere beyond our thin walls and battery-powered devices, something in the forest had answered our arrival. Not with attack, not with chaos, but with a measured sound that felt less like a threat and more like a boundary being marked. Morning in Oregon does not arrive with sunlight. It arrives with moisture, a fine layer of mist clinging to fabric and skin, as if the forest exhales directly onto whatever dared remain through the night. I unzipped the tent to a world drained of contrast, trunks dissolving upward into pale fog, the fire pit reduced to a circle of cold ash, and for a brief second I could almost convince myself that the 3 knocks had been a shared hallucination, born from suggestion and fatigue, until I saw Lena already kneeling near the edge of the clearing, headphones on, replaying the audio from the recorders we had left in the dark. Ethan stood a few steps behind her, with his hands in his pockets, silent in a way that told me something had changed. I walked over without speaking and waited until Lena lifted one side of the headphones and offered them to me. The recording began with the soft hum of nocturnal insects and the distant creak of branches. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., 3 distinct impacts, clean, resonant, each separated by the same measured interval we had counted by ear, not wind, not random debris, something striking wood with intention. The sound vibrated through the tiny speakers, with a depth that felt disproportionate to its simplicity. Lena whispered that she had isolated the frequency, and there was no overlapping animal call, no echo distortion that would suggest multiple branches colliding, just 3 controlled hits, and then silence. Ethan exhaled slowly and said that if someone was out there messing with us, they had remarkable discipline. But the nearest marked trail was miles away, and no headlights had cut through the trees during the night. We packed quickly, not out of panic, but out of a collective instinct to move, to follow the direction from which the sound had traveled. The moss beneath our boots dampened footsteps to near silence as we advanced beyond the perimeter of the clearing. And within minutes the familiar geometry of camp disappeared behind layered trunks and ferns taller than my waist. The deeper we went, the more evidence of old logging emerged, massive stumps flattened like ancient tables, their rings exposed and blackened with age, rusted fragments of chain half buried in soil, and here and there the skeletal remains of machinery reduced to oxidized shapes swallowed by vegetation. Ethan filmed continuously, capturing the contrast between decay and regrowth. Younger trees rising straight and thin among the ruins of giants, while Lena monitored the ambient sound, occasionally pausing to adjust sensitivity levels as if expecting another signal. I found myself scanning the ground more than the horizon, searching for irregularities. And it was Lena who saw it first. A depression in the mud, near what must have once been a loading area. Not a clear footprint, not the cartoonish outline people imagine when they speak of Bigfoot, but something broader than a human step, deeper at the heel, the front tapering slightly before vanishing into fir needles. Ethan crouched to measure it against his own boot, and the comparison required no exaggeration. Whatever pressed there had carried more weight than any of us. I felt a tightening in my throat that was not triumph, but recognition, because Daniel once sketched a similar shape in the margin of his journal, labeling it uncertain substrate distortion. Unwilling to commit to what he suspected, we followed the faint line of impressions until they dissolved into harder ground, and in that gradual disappearance lay the most unsettling detail. The stride length suggested balance, not stumbling, a bipedal rhythm that felt deliberate rather than animalistic. Ethan muttered that it could still be a hoax, a staged print pressed with a carved mold. But there were no secondary tool marks, no sign of tampering, just pressure, weight, and direction. As we pressed onward, the forest thickened. The fog lifting slightly to reveal a subtle rise ahead, where trees grew in a peculiar arrangement, their trunks angled inward as if responding to a shared force years ago. I recognized the formation from Daniel's last annotated map, a circled area marked only with the word center. My pulse quickened despite myself. And when we reached the crest of the rise, the ground opened into a shallow basin, ringed by fallen timber, arranged not randomly, but radially, trunks laid in arcs that formed the faint outline of a circle, long reclaimed by moss. Lena stood motionless at the edge, whispering that it looked constructed. Ethan circled slowly, filming every angle, and I stepped into the basin with a care that bordered on reverence. The air inside felt cooler, muted, as if the surrounding wood absorbed more than sound. Fragments of woven branches lay collapsed near the center, thicker than any animal nest I had seen, too interlaced to be the casual byproduct of a storm. And as I knelt to examine one of the branches, I noticed a break, not splintered outward like wind damage, but snapped inward with force, pressure applied from outside the circle rather than within. Lena called out softly and pointed toward a nearby stump where something metallic glinted through the moss. I brushed it free and felt the unmistakable cold curve of a spent shell casing, old but intact. The brass dulled by years of damp, Daniel carried a sidearm on field expeditions, more for reassurance than aggression. And seeing that small artifact in this place compressed time violently, the abstract grief of 15 years collapsing into a single tangible object resting in my palm. Ethan lowered his camera slightly, perhaps sensing that this was no longer just footage, but evidence. And for a moment none of us spoke. The forest seemed to lean inward around the circle, not with hostility, but with a density that suggested memory. I imagined Daniel standing where I stood, hearing the same layered silence, weighing curiosity against caution, and I wondered whether the first shot he fired had been warning or fear. The question echoed internally, until Lena's recorder emitted a faint spike, a sudden low-frequency vibration not audible to the naked ear, but visible on her display. She raised a hand for quiet, and we listened. At first nothing, then from somewhere beyond the ring of trees, a single impact struck wood. Not 3 this time, just one, heavier, closer. Ethan instinctively swung the camera toward the sound, but the fog between trunks remained unbroken. The silence that followed felt expectant, as if something had observed us enter this space and was now recalculating. I felt the weight of the shell casing grow disproportionate in my grip and slipped it into my pocket. Not as proof for an audience, but as a fragment of my brother's final decision. And standing within that broken circle in the heart of a forest that had survived axes and fire and men with contracts, I understood that we had not merely followed a sound deeper into the trees. We had stepped into a place that once belonged to something else. And whatever had marked the night with 3 deliberate knocks was now aware that we were standing in the remains of what it had lost. We did not speak for several seconds after that single knock, the sound still hanging in the damp air, like a line drawn between us and whatever stood beyond the ring of trees. Ethan slowly lowered the camera, but did not turn it off, the red recording light blinking against the muted green around us. Lena's breathing shallow as she adjusted the gain on her recorder, hoping to catch anything else beneath the silence. But the forest offered nothing more. No rustle, no retreating steps, only the distant drip of condensed fog falling from branch to branch. And in that restraint there was something more unsettling than a charge or a scream, because an attack would have been instinctive, chaotic animal. This felt measured, as if we had been acknowledged and assessed, and for the first time since returning to Oregon I felt not like an investigator, but like a trespasser, standing inside the outline of a home that had been destroyed years ago. I stepped back out of the circle slowly, careful not to disturb the woven debris any further, and motioned for the others to do the same, not out of fear exactly, but out of a recognition I could not fully articulate, as though remaining there longer would shift something we did not yet understand. Ethan whispered that we should mark the coordinates and come back better prepared. Drones, thermal imaging, more people, more light, the practical escalation of modern inquiry, and hearing him list those tools made the back of my neck tighten, because I suddenly imagined the low hum of propellers above this basin, the intrusion of mechanical noise into a space that had already endured chainsaws once before. Lena looked at me instead of Ethan, waiting for a decision that felt heavier than a simple production choice. I nodded slowly and said we would pull back for now, document what we had found, and return tomorrow at first light. Though even as I said it, I sensed that the forest did not measure time in our increments, that tomorrow was irrelevant to something that had already waited 15 years without forgetting. We retraced our path carefully, scanning for additional impressions in the soil. And about halfway back to camp, Ethan stopped abruptly, pointing toward a cedar trunk at shoulder height, 3 fresh marks carved into the bark, parallel, deep, the exposed wood pale against the darker outer layer. I moved closer and placed my fingers near the grooves without touching them. They were higher than my own reach and spaced wider than any knife blade I had ever held. The cuts were clean, but not precise, in the way steel is precise, more like something dragged with force. Lena quietly said, "There had been no such marks when we passed earlier," and I knew she was right, because I had been looking for them. My heart thudded harder now, not from panic, but from implication. The single knock in the basin, the fresh marks on the tree, the positioning along our path back to camp. It formed a sequence too aligned to dismiss as coincidence. Ethan muttered that someone could be tracking us, trying to spook us, but there were no secondary footprints around the base of the cedar, only our own prints overlapping in damp soil. I forced myself to breathe evenly and reminded them that wildlife can mark territory, that claw marks on trees are not uncommon. Yet the height and symmetry argued against the comfort of that explanation. When we finally broke back into the clearing where our tents stood, the space felt altered, not physically, nothing overturned or disturbed, but perceptually, as though the perimeter had shifted while we were gone. Lena immediately checked the recorders she had left near camp and scrolled through the timeline, her eyes narrowing as she isolated a short segment from less than 20 minutes earlier. While we had been inside the circle, 3 impacts again, closer than before, followed by a pause, and then a 4th. Softer strike, not part of the original pattern. Something new layered onto the old rhythm. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he said that was enough for one day, that we needed to regroup. But I found myself staring into the tree line opposite the direction of the basin, because from that angle the trunks formed a narrow corridor of darker shadow, and in that corridor, for the briefest fraction of a second, I thought I saw movement, not the clear outline of a body, not a cinematic silhouette, just a shift in density, as if a shape had separated itself from the background and then merged back in before my mind could confirm it. I did not tell the others immediately, unsure whether it was perception or projection, but the sensation of being observed intensified until it felt almost physical, a pressure between the shoulder blades. I took a slow step forward, ignoring Ethan's warning tone as he asked what I was doing, and spoke into the open air without raising my voice, saying we were not here to cut anything, that we would not damage the forest, that we only wanted answers. The words felt fragile as soon as they left me, human language dissolving against trunks that had stood longer than any vow I could make. Nothing responded at first, only the faint stir of wind high above, and then, from deeper in the woods, 3 deliberate knocks, closer than any before, resonant enough that I felt them in my ribs. Lena's recorder captured them clearly. Ethan's camera trembled slightly in his grip, and I understood with cold clarity that this was not random, not a wandering animal brushing branches. It was a pattern re-established in our presence, a line redrawn after we stepped into a place that once held something important. I did not feel hatred in that sound, not rage, but a warning that carried memory. And as dusk began to settle again over the clearing, turning the edges of the forest into layered shadow, I realized that returning here had not simply reopened an old investigation. It had reopened a boundary. And whatever had answered us tonight was not hunting blindly. It was reminding us that we were standing on ground where something had already been taken. And as the final echo of those 3 knocks faded into the deepening dark, I understood that this was only the beginning of a conversation the forest had been waiting 15 years to resume. The rain began sometime before dawn, and did not fall in drops so much as it settled into the forest like a decision, soaking bark, darkening soil, deepening every scent in this part of Oregon, until the air itself felt heavier to breathe. And when I stepped out of the tent, the clearing looked smaller than it had the night before, the trees leaning inward as if closing ranks. After the conversation we had forced upon them, Ethan was already awake, reviewing footage beneath the shelter of the tarp we had stretched between 2 trunks, the glow of his monitor pale against the gray morning, while Lena stood at the edge of camp, listening through headphones to the recordings of the final 3 knocks. Her face composed but tighter than usual. None of us said much at first because there is a difference between experiencing something and replaying it. And hearing the pattern again in daylight did not make it less deliberate. If anything, it made it harder to dismiss. The 4th, softer strike at the end of the sequence lingered in the wave form like an afterthought, or perhaps a correction. And Ethan finally broke the silence by saying we should return to the basin, document everything in controlled light, take proper measurements, and then decide how far we were willing to push this. I agreed outwardly, but internally I was already aware that the word push implied force, and force had been the catalyst for everything that happened here 15 years ago. We packed efficiently and moved out without lighting a fire, the forest floor slick beneath our boots. And as we walked, I noticed how quickly nature had reclaimed the scars of logging, moss swallowing metal, saplings rising through cracked concrete foundations. And yet the memory of the cut lingered in the geometry of the land, in the unnatural spacing between trunks, in the absence where giants once stood. Daniel had written about this in his notes, describing how certain sections of forest seemed to carry a tension after being disturbed, as if something invisible resisted the intrusion long after the machines were gone. And I wondered now whether that tension was psychological projection or something more ancient. As we approached the basin again, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the circular formation clearly. Fallen trunks radiating outward like ribs around a hollow center, and standing there in daylight stripped away some of the immediate fear, but replaced it with scale. The woven debris at the core, larger than I had registered the previous afternoon. Branches bent and interlocked in ways that suggested repetition over time, rather than a single event. Lena began photographing the structure from multiple angles, while Ethan measured distances between trunks, narrating observations about the orientation of breaks, pointing out that several of the fallen trees appeared to have been pushed rather than cut, their roots partially exposed, but not severed cleanly. I knelt again near the spot where we found the shell casing and scanned the surrounding ground more carefully, brushing aside damp needles until I uncovered another small fragment of brass half buried in mud. 2 casings within a few feet of each other. Not random, not scattered, but clustered. Daniel had fired at least twice, maybe more, and the implication pressed against my ribs with uncomfortable weight, because whatever stood here that night had not been a fleeting shadow. It had been close enough to justify repeated shots, close enough to create panic or urgency. Ethan called us over to the edge of the circle, where he had found a fresh break in a sapling. The wood split inward again, fibers compressed rather than torn outward, and at roughly 8 feet above ground, the bark bore a faint indentation, shaped like pressure rather than claw. Lena raised her camera to capture scale, while Ethan stretched his arm upward to demonstrate the height. Falling short by nearly a foot, the physicality of it grounded the moment in something tangible. Not myth, not folklore, but mass and leverage. And yet the basin did not feel violent in the way a predation site does. There were no scattered bones, no fur, no obvious signs of feeding or territorial display, only structure and disruption layered over each other like the memory of a home dismantled. As we documented each detail, I became increasingly aware of the silence beyond the circle. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of birds, specifically. No distant calls, no wing beats. The ecosystem around us subdued as though something higher in the chain had claimed priority. Lena noticed it too and whispered that even insects seemed sparse here. A void in ambient life that suggested either coincidence or influence. And then, just as Ethan began discussing the possibility of returning with thermal equipment, a low vibration traveled through the ground, subtle enough that I might have mistaken it for distant thunder if the sky had not been clear. It was not a quake or a tremor in the dramatic sense, just a shift, a transfer of weight somewhere beyond the outer ring of trees. We froze instinctively, listening not just with ears but with posture. The vibration did not repeat immediately, but the knowledge that something capable of generating it was within proximity settled into the space between us. Ethan slowly rotated the camera toward the direction of the sensation, lens searching through layers of trunk and shadow. And I felt again that familiar sensation from the previous evening. Not hunted, but evaluated, as if the forest itself had eyes distributed among bark and branch. I took a step backward toward the edge of the basin, consciously breaking the boundary we had crossed earlier, and the air seemed to lighten by a fraction. Lena's recorder spiked briefly again, capturing a low-frequency rumble that did not resolve into a roar or growl, but into something closer, to breath amplified by distance. Ethan whispered that we should leave, not out of fear, but out of calculation. And I nodded, because the pattern was emerging clearly now. The 3 knocks as announcement, the single heavier strike as correction, the fresh marks along our path, and now this weight in motion that did not reveal itself visually, but made its presence known physically. As we retreated from the circle, I glanced once more at the woven center and imagined Daniel standing there, years earlier, confronted by the same evidence, forced to decide between documentation and withdrawal. And I wondered whether the first shot he fired had been the moment the boundary shifted permanently. Because as we stepped fully out of the basin and the ambient sounds of the wider forest gradually returned, I understood that this place was not random terrain marked by superstition. It was a focal point, a scar layered over something that had existed long before chainsaws, and whatever moved beyond our line of sight now was not reacting blindly. It was remembering. We did not speak until the basin was out of sight, and the density of the forest returned to something that resembled normal terrain, though normal no longer felt like an accurate word for anything in this region of Oregon. Ethan finally exhaled and said what all of us were thinking, that whatever caused that ground shift had mass, real, measurable mass, and that the absence of visible movement did not reduce the implication. Lena kept her recorder running even as we walked, scanning the low frequencies in real time as if expecting another tremor. But the forest resumed its surface-level behavior, a few distant bird calls returning cautiously, wind sliding through upper branches. The illusion of balance restored just enough to make us question what we had felt minutes earlier. Back at camp, Ethan spread printed stills from the morning's footage across a flat equipment case, enlarging frames that captured the broken sapling, the indentation at 8 feet, the partial impressions in mud, and for the first time the conversation shifted from atmosphere to analysis. He overlaid scale markers, compared stride estimations, calculated probable height ranges based on break angles, and the numbers that emerged were uncomfortable in their consistency. If the impressions represented a bipedal gait, the subject would stand well above 7 feet, possibly closer to 8, with a stride length exceeding normal human proportion without mechanical assistance. Lena added that the audio patterns suggested deliberate spacing rather than erratic contact, the interval between each knock nearly identical across recordings, and I watched them move from skepticism toward reluctant acknowledgement. Not because they believed in folklore, but because the data refused to collapse into simpler explanations. I stepped away from the equipment and walked toward the far edge of camp where a cluster of younger firs grew tightly together, their trunks thin but resilient. And there, at shoulder height along one of them, I noticed another fresh mark, not as deep as the cedar carving from the previous day, but unmistakably recent. Bark, peeled back in a narrow vertical strip. Sap, still wet. I called the others over, and Ethan examined it carefully, running a finger along the edge without pressing into the exposed wood. The height matched the earlier marks with unsettling precision. And what disturbed me most was not the existence of the mark, but its placement. It faced directly toward our tents, aligned almost perfectly with the center of camp. Lena whispered that it felt like positioning rather than random damage, and the word positioning lodged in my mind with weight, because it implied perspective, implied that whatever had made it had considered where we were standing when it chose that trunk. Ethan suggested we set up a secondary camera line facing into the trees rather than outward from camp, reversing the orientation of observation. And I agreed, though the idea carried an undercurrent of escalation. We mounted 2 motion-activated units at opposing angles and tested their range, careful not to disturb too much foliage in the process. As afternoon settled and a thin beam of sunlight finally pierced the canopy, illuminating particles of moisture suspended in air, and for a brief moment the forest looked almost serene, the basin incident reduced to something that might be rationalized later with enough distance. But that illusion fractured when Lena replayed a new segment from her recorder, captured while we were inside the circle earlier that morning, beneath our own footsteps and low conversation. There was a second rhythm, faint but synchronized, not matching our pace exactly yet close enough to suggest parallel movement, something adjusting position just beyond visual range, moving when we moved, stopping when we stopped. The realization rippled through the 3 of us simultaneously. Because it redefined the dynamic from isolated signs to interactive tracking, Ethan muttered that if someone was shadowing us, it required extraordinary coordination and patience. Yet no additional human footprints had been found, no snapped twigs at ground level, no cigarette butts or food wrappers, nothing that signaled another camp within miles. I felt the old memory of Daniel's last week surface again, the way he described in one email a sensation of being mirrored, of hearing steps that were not echoes but responses. At the time, I dismissed it as sleep deprivation or heightened nerves. Now the pattern felt disturbingly familiar, and as evening approached once more, the forest seemed to anticipate the transition, shadows stretching earlier than expected, temperature dropping with sudden decisiveness. We gathered near the fire pit but did not light it immediately, choosing instead to sit in dimness and listen. Ethan's camera rested on his knee, ready but not intrusive. Lena's headphones pressed tight against her ears, scanning, waiting, and I found myself staring into the corridor of darker trunks opposite the fresh mark on the fur, replaying the low vibration from the basin in my mind, wondering how something of that scale could remain unseen unless it understood concealment better than we understood detection. The first knock did not come until full dusk. A single strike from somewhere to our right, not close enough to be within the clearing but not distant either. We held still, counting unconsciously, but there was no second strike immediately following. Instead, there was movement, subtle but undeniable, a shift of mass behind the nearest row of trees, branches flexing without wind. Ethan raised the camera slowly and zoomed toward the disturbance, the frame capturing only layered shadow and faint oscillation of leaves. Then from directly ahead, opposite the first sound, 2 knocks in rapid succession, completing the pattern from a different direction. Lena inhaled sharply as her recorder peaked. 3 knocks total but split across space, not sequential from one trunk, but distributed, as if triangulating our position. The strategy embedded in that rhythm chilled me more than any imagined roar could have, because it suggested coordination within a single intelligence, not random territorial marking, not blind warning, but adjustment, mapping. And as the final echo dissolved into the encroaching night, I realized that whatever occupied this forest was not merely defending a scar from 15 years ago. It was actively responding to our presence now, recalibrating the boundary in real time, and the unsettling truth settled over me with quiet certainty. We were no longer documenting remnants of a past event. We were participating in something ongoing. Night settled over the forest in Oregon with a density that felt almost deliberate, as if the darkness were not merely the absence of light, but an active presence pressing inward from every direction. And after the distributed pattern of knocks at dusk, none of us pretended this was coincidence anymore. Ethan adjusted the infrared settings on the forward-facing camera, while Lena repositioned one of the recorders closer to the fresh mark on the fir tree. The exposed sap still glistening faintly in residual twilight. We had crossed from curiosity into awareness, and awareness carried weight. I suggested we avoid lighting the fire that night, removing at least one variable from the equation. And though Ethan hesitated, pointing out the practical comfort of visibility, he agreed, perhaps sensing that illumination might feel like provocation. So we sat in near darkness, screens dimmed, equipment humming softly, listening as the forest recalibrated around us. At first, the usual nocturnal sounds returned in scattered fragments. A distant owl, the dry friction of bark shifting as temperature dropped. But beneath that surface layer there was a cadence that did not belong to insects or wind, a pacing, faint yet rhythmic, something heavy, placing weight carefully rather than carelessly. Lena's display flickered with low-frequency spikes that rose and fell in intervals too structured to dismiss. Ethan's camera remained trained on the corridor of trees where earlier movement had registered, and I found myself counting breaths to steady the rising tension in my chest, because fear would distort perception, and I needed clarity more than adrenaline. Several minutes passed with no direct escalation, and the stillness grew thick enough to blur edges of thought. Then from our left came a single knock, louder than any before, close enough that the impact vibrated through the soil beneath my boots. We remained motionless, waiting for the remaining two to complete the pattern. But instead of immediate repetition, there was silence, elongated and intentional, as if the pause itself were part of the message. Ethan whispered that it sounded within 50 yards. Lena mouthed closer. And before either of us could respond, the second knock struck from directly behind our tents. Not the left flank, but the rear perimeter, sharp and resonant, the repositioning so swift it implied either extraordinary speed or pre-existing placement. My pulse hammered, but I forced myself not to turn abruptly, because sudden motion felt like surrender to panic. And then the third knock landed ahead of us again, completing the sequence in a triangle around camp, not linear, not distant, but enclosing. Lena's recorder clipped briefly under the intensity. Ethan's infrared display flickered as he adjusted focus, searching for thermal anomalies between trunks, and for a fraction of a second, a shape interrupted the uniform coolness of the forest. A vertical distortion slightly warmer than its surroundings, too large to be a deer, too upright to be bear. There and gone before the frame stabilized, Ethan swore under his breath and replayed the last few seconds. But the blur resolved into nothing conclusive, just layered shadow and digital noise. Yet the fact that the camera registered any deviation at all confirmed what our bodies already knew. Something substantial had moved within proximity. The pacing resumed then, slow, measured, circling without haste, the ground transmitting faint tremors at irregular intervals. Not a charge, not a retreat, but patrol. mapping our boundaries as we had mapped the basin earlier that day. And in that mirrored behavior lay the most unsettling truth. We were being studied with the same analytical restraint we believed we possessed. Lena leaned closer to me and whispered that the intervals between impacts corresponded to repositioning arcs, not random wandering. As if whatever stood beyond the tree line understood perimeter control instinctively, Ethan suggested we trigger the floodlight attached to the secondary rig, just for a burst, to break the pattern. But something in me resisted the escalation, because 15 years earlier, escalation had likely been the pivot point. Daniel firing into darkness at a presence he did not yet comprehend. I shook my head, and instead stepped forward a single pace toward the center of the clearing, raising my empty hands to chest level, not theatrically, but visibly, and spoke quietly into the dark, saying we were not cutting, not hunting, not taking anything, that we would leave in the morning if that was required. The words sounded fragile against timber older than our language, but the pacing paused almost immediately after I finished, the forest holding breath in response. Seconds stretched long enough to question whether the halt was coincidence. Then from directly ahead, deeper than any previous source, came a low exhalation amplified by sighs. Not a roar, not a growl, but a sustained release of air that vibrated in my sternum. Ethan's thermal display flared again briefly at the edge of detection range, a mass partially obscured by overlapping trunks. And this time, the distortion held for a full second before slipping laterally behind thicker cover, confirming height well above average human range. Lena's recorder captured the breath clearly, its waveform dwarfing previous spikes. And then, without warning, the pacing resumed, but outward rather than inward, weight shifting away from camp in slow retreat. No crash of branches, no reckless flight, just controlled withdrawal. As if a decision had been reached, the silence that followed felt altered, not empty but reset, the boundary redefined rather than erased. Ethan lowered the camera gradually and exhaled shakily, whispering that whatever that was, it chose not to advance. Lena removed her headphones slowly, eyes wide but focused, and I felt a mixture of relief and realization settle over me, because the interaction had not escalated into violence. Despite proximity, it had become a negotiation of space, the 3 knocks forming enclosure, the breath marking presence, the retreat signaling acknowledgement. And as the temperature dropped further and stars struggled faintly through breaks in the canopy, I understood that we had crossed from documenting traces of the past into direct engagement with something operating under its own logic, something that remembered the basin, remembered gunfire, remembered intrusion, and tonight it had demonstrated capacity without unleashing force, the implication heavier than any attack would have been, because restraint implies choice, and choice implies intelligence. And as we remained seated in darkness, listening to the forest resume its layered nocturnal rhythm, I knew with quiet certainty that the line we were standing on was not a relic of history, but a living boundary being actively maintained. And whether we stayed or left, whether we published footage or erased it, that boundary would remain, marked not by fences or signs, but by 3 deliberate knocks that echoed through timber long after human noise faded. By the 3rd morning, the forest in Oregon no longer felt like terrain we had entered, but like a system we had been temporarily permitted to occupy. The difference subtle, yet unmistakable, as if the trees themselves had recalibrated around our presence and were now observing without urgency the pacing and knocks of the previous nights absent at dawn, replaced instead by a silence that felt heavier. Precisely because it was undisturbed, Ethan moved through camp with controlled efficiency, reviewing thermal anomalies frame by frame, searching for confirmation in pixels, while Lena cataloged the audio files with a discipline that bordered on ritual, labeling each sequence by timestamp and direction. But beneath their methodical focus lingered a shared awareness that data alone would not contextualize what we were experiencing. We needed history, not legend, not speculation about Bigfoot as an abstract idea, but local memory. Someone who had lived through the logging years, someone who had seen the forest before and after the cut. And I knew exactly who that person was because Daniel had mentioned him more than once in his notes. A former ranger who refused relocation when the department consolidated stations. A man named Elias Brooks, who chose to remain in a weathered cabin several miles north of the basin, living within walking distance of the very scar we had documented. Daniel described him not as a believer or skeptic, but as a witness, someone who measured change in bark patterns and bird migration, rather than headlines. And so, by mid-morning, we packed minimal equipment and set out toward the coordinates Daniel had once marked, with a small cross beside the word Brooks. The trail leading away from our camp, narrower than the old logging road, more suggestion than path, ferns brushing against our knees as we advanced. And with each step the atmosphere shifted from contested ground to something older and quieter. As though this section of forest had been spared the most aggressive intrusion, the trees here stood thicker, trunks wider, their bark layered in moss so dense it resembled fabric, sunlight filtering through in narrow shafts that illuminated suspended moisture like drifting dust in an abandoned house. And after nearly an hour of walking, the outline of the cabin emerged gradually between trunks. Not abandoned, but not fully maintained either. Its wooden siding darkened by years of rain, roof slightly bowed yet intact, smoke absent from the chimney, but a stack of chopped wood arranged neatly along one wall. Ethan slowed instinctively, lowering his camera as if approaching a sacred site rather than a dwelling. Lena removed her headphones, perhaps sensing that conversation here should not be mediated through circuitry. And I felt a tension unlike the previous nights, not the awareness of being enclosed, but the anticipation of being evaluated by someone human who had chosen to remain where others left. I stepped forward alone and knocked once against the cabin door. The sound, dull, against aged timber. A pause, stretching long enough to question whether Daniel's notes were outdated. Then the faint scrape of a chair inside, followed by measured footsteps. The door opened only halfway, revealing a face carved by time and weather, gray beard untrimmed, eyes sharp despite age. Elias Brooks regarded us without surprise, as though he had been expecting not specifically us, but someone like us, drawn back by unfinished business in the woods. I introduced myself and saw the faintest flicker of recognition at Daniel's name. Not shock, not alarm, but memory settling into place. He studied me a moment longer, and then stepped aside, without invitation or refusal, allowing us to enter the cabin's dim interior, where the scent of old paper and wood smoke lingered in layers. Maps covered one wall, hand-annotated with markings that predated digital surveys. topographic lines intersected by small symbols and notes written in tight script. Ethan's eyes moved immediately to those maps, while Lena remained near the doorway, absorbing the atmosphere. Elias closed the door behind us and spoke in a voice rough but steady, saying that men with cameras usually come chasing stories, but men who come back after 15 years are chasing something else. And the accuracy of that statement silenced any rehearsed explanation I had prepared. I told him about the basin, about the shell casings, about the distributed knocks that encircled our camp, and he listened without interruption, not nodding, not dismissing, simply absorbing. Then he walked to the wall and traced a finger along a section of map corresponding to the circle we had found, tapping once against the paper. Before looking back at me, he said that area was marked closed long before the logging company claimed access, not officially closed by government decree but by consensus among those who worked the forest, a place hunters avoided, a place where animals moved differently, where tree breaks appeared at heights inconsistent with storms. He spoke of the logging season 15 years ago, not as a business operation, but as a violation of rhythm, machines entering at dawn and leaving at dusk, the constant whine of saws fracturing the layered silence that had existed for centuries. And he mentioned Daniel without accusation, only stating that my brother had asked questions others avoided, that he walked beyond flagged boundaries to understand what was being cut. And when I asked directly whether he believed something lived within that basin, Elias did not answer with myth or denial. He simply said that the forest holds patterns, and when those patterns are broken, something responds, not out of malice, but out of correction. His gaze steady, unblinking, as if measuring whether I was prepared to hear more than I thought I wanted to know. Elias did not rush his words, and in the quiet interior of the cabin in Oregon, the pauses between his sentences carried as much weight as the statements themselves. He moved toward a small iron stove, though no fire burned inside it, and rested his hand against its cool surface, as if grounding himself in something tangible before continuing. He said that 15 years ago the logging crews were warned, not by officials, but by those who had walked these woods long enough to recognize the signs. There were sections where the animals shifted migration without visible cause, where elk would not cross a certain line even during heavy snow, where birds circled but refused to nest. Daniel had noticed these anomalies too, Elias explained. He had come to the cabin 3 evenings in a row with maps folded under his arm, asking about broken saplings at unnatural heights and tree knocks heard after midnight. At the time, Elias told him what he tells anyone who listens carefully, that the forest is not empty simply because we lack names for what moves within it. Ethan leaned forward at that but did not interrupt, his skepticism tempered now by nights of measured rhythm and triangulated sound. Lena quietly activated her recorder without making it obvious, and Elias continued, describing the night the machines entered the basin, saying the company had pushed past agreed boundaries under pressure to meet quota, ignoring the older survey marks that indicated unstable ground and ecological sensitivity. Daniel had been there, documenting the expansion, arguing with a foreman about the flagged line, and sometime after dusk, the first knock was heard from deeper in the timber, at first dismissed as wood settling or a stray branch, but then repeated 3 impacts spaced with unnerving consistency. Elias said the workers laughed until the third sequence echoed from a different direction, and that was when the laughter stopped. He did not claim to have seen anything clearly that night. Only movement at the edge of floodlights, shapes withdrawing before focus could settle. And then he described something that tightened my chest. He said Daniel came to him the following morning shaken but resolute, stating that he believed the circle at the center of the basin was not debris from storm or accident, but the remains of a constructed shelter, woven over time and violently dismantled by machinery. Daniel had found impressions in mud, similar to the ones we recorded, and he had collected audio of the knocks that mirrored Lena's files almost exactly. Ethan exchanged a glance with her at that confirmation, and Elias's voice lowered slightly. As he recounted the final evening before the disappearance, the logging company had returned with heavier equipment, ignoring the previous night's disturbances. Daniel followed them beyond the flagged line again, and shortly after full dark, 2 gunshots cracked through the forest, separated by several seconds, not warning shots into the air, but angled toward something at ground level. Elias heard the echoes roll through timber, and then the machines shut down abruptly. Silence falling heavier than any engine noise, he waited nearly an hour before walking toward the source of the sound. And what he found was not carnage but absence. The equipment left idling without operators, a loader tilted awkwardly as if abandoned mid-maneuver. And near the center of the basin the woven structure flattened, the ground churned. Yet no bodies, no clear trail of blood, only disturbed soil and broken branches radiating outward like a ripple. The workers later claimed panic, claimed confusion, claimed that Daniel had fired at something that rushed from the trees, but their statements contradicted each other in details. Some insisted they saw a bear. Others swore it stood upright longer than any bear could. The company's official report cited wildlife aggression and trespass into unstable terrain. And within weeks, the operation was shut down under legal scrutiny. Unrelated to the disappearance, the basin left to reclaim itself in silence. I asked Elias why he had never publicly contradicted the report, and he looked at me steadily before answering that truth without proof becomes spectacle, and spectacle invites more intrusion. He said that if something had survived that night, it would have learned quickly that human curiosity multiplies once fed, and that restraint was sometimes the only protection left to offer a place already violated. Lena's recorder hummed softly between us as she captured every word, and I realized that Elias was not framing the story in terms of monster or myth, but consequence. Pattern disrupted leading to response. Response misinterpreted as threat. Escalation resulting in disappearance. He then walked to a shelf and retrieved a small tin box, opening it carefully to reveal a single spent casing identical to the ones we found in the basin. He placed it on the table between us without flourish, saying Daniel had brought it to him earlier that day, before returning to confront the crew again, stating he hoped not to use the remaining rounds, and the weight of that admission pressed into the room. Because it suggested Daniel did not arrive armed with aggression, but with apprehension, Ethan finally asked the question that had lingered unspoken, whether Elias believed something still occupied that territory now, 15 years later. And Elias did not hesitate this time. He said occupation was the wrong word, that the forest does not belong to what moves within it any more than it belongs to us, but that something there maintains the boundary with intention. and if we had heard 3 knocks, it meant we were close enough to matter. His eyes shifted briefly toward the door as if listening beyond the walls. And in that subtle gesture, I sensed that whatever awareness we felt at camp was not confined to open ground, but extended even here, to the threshold of the cabin itself. Elias stood there for a moment longer with his hand resting on the table beside the single spent casing, and in the dim interior of the cabin in Oregon, the silence that followed his last words felt heavier than any of the knocks we had recorded, because this silence carried memory, not mystery. I asked him why he stayed after that night, why he chose to remain within walking distance of a place most people avoided, even in daylight, and he answered without dramatics, saying that leaving would have felt like surrendering the last witness position, that someone needed to remain who understood the difference between intrusion and presence. He said he had walked the perimeter of the basin many times in the years after the disappearance, never crossing into the center again, only listening, and that the pattern of 3 knocks persisted periodically, not nightly, not predictably, but always in response to something that altered the forest's rhythm, hunters venturing too deep, surveyors placing new markers, hikers straying beyond visible trail. He described it not as hunting behavior but as correction, and the word echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Because correction implies intent, not chaos. Ethan asked whether Elias had ever seen it clearly, whether he could confirm what we had only captured in fragments of thermal distortion and shadow. And Elias hesitated for the first time, not out of doubt, but out of care in choosing language. He said he had seen enough to abandon disbelief, but not enough to assign certainty. He spoke of a silhouette at dawn once, standing between 2 cedars at a distance that blurred detail yet preserved scale, taller than any man he had known, shoulders broader than logic preferred, still in a way that felt deliberate rather than frozen by fear. He said what unsettled him most was not size, but composure, the absence of frantic movement, even when observed, as if observation itself were anticipated. Lena's recorder captured the faint tremor in his voice as he admitted that the silhouette had turned its head slowly toward him before stepping backward into shadow, without breaking a single branch, and that controlled withdrawal had convinced him more than any footprint. I felt a chill travel through me, not from cold, but from recognition, because that mirrored exactly what we had experienced the previous night at camp. The triangulated knocks, the breath, the retreat, the negotiation of distance rather than a charge. I asked him about Daniel's final hours, about whether he believed my brother had fired in panic or in defense of someone else, and Elias looked down at the casing on the table before answering. He said Daniel was not reckless, that he had argued for caution even with the logging crew, that the second shot likely came after the first failed to create space, and that whatever approached did not behave like a cornered animal. There was no immediate attack on the machines, no scattering of workers, only a focused movement toward the center where the woven structure had stood, as if the confrontation was not with people broadly, but with the act of destruction itself. Ethan shifted uncomfortably at that, perhaps realizing that our cameras and thermal rigs were smaller versions of the same intrusion, and Elias added that after that night, he found no clear human remains, only disturbance and silence. The company pressured local authorities to close the file quickly, citing liability and wildlife unpredictability. And he chose not to contradict them publicly, because doing so would have invited sensationalism, expeditions, armed thrill-seekers chasing the legend of Bigfoot, rather than respecting the boundary. He then walked toward the door and opened it slightly, letting in a blade of gray afternoon light, and asked us whether we had crossed into the circle itself. When I admitted that we had stepped inside, documented, measured, and lingered. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger but in concern. He said the circle was never meant to be catalogued, that it had once been layered over time, woven, maintained perhaps as shelter, perhaps as marker, and that breaking it with machines had altered more than wood. Lena asked quietly whether he believed something had been lost that night beyond Daniel. And Elias answered that loss does not always mean extinction. Sometimes it means displacement, and displacement breeds vigilance. The word vigilance hung in the air like an invisible weight, because it implied that what remained in that forest was not wounded beyond function, but sharpened by memory. Ethan asked whether Elias would come with us to the basin, to stand at the edge and confirm what he knew, and for a moment I thought he would refuse, but instead he closed the door gently and nodded once, saying that perhaps it was time to see how the forest responded to 4 instead of 3. His agreement did not feel like alliance but like acceptance of a turning point. As we stepped back outside the cabin, the air felt cooler, the canopy filtering light into thin, fractured lines across the ground. And I noticed that even here, away from the basin, the birds had gone quiet. Not in panic, but in pause, as if something in the broader pattern had shifted with our decision to return. We gathered minimal equipment, no drones, no floodlights, just cameras and recorders, and as we began walking back toward the scar at the heart of the forest, I sensed that this third approach would not mirror the first 2, because now we were not merely investigators tracing echoes of the past. We were bringing the last witness back to the boundary, and if vigilance truly governed that territory, then our movement would not go unanswered. The walk back toward the basin felt different with Elias beside us, not because he carried weapons or equipment, but because he carried memory. And memory changes the way space is perceived. The forest in Oregon seemed to register his presence the way it had registered ours days earlier. Subtle shifts in ambient sound, a thinning of birdsong, the faint sense that movement beyond the visible tree line had adjusted in response. Elias did not speak as we moved, his pace steady despite age, boots finding stable ground without hesitation, as if he had walked this route in darkness more than once. Ethan kept the camera low and unobtrusive, resisting the urge to narrate. Lena monitored the audio levels, but avoided raising sensitivity too high, none of us wanting to provoke by amplification alone. And when the outer edge of the basin finally came into view through the trunks, Elias slowed, not from fear, but from recognition, his eyes scanning the fallen timber arranged in that radial pattern we had documented, the broken circle reclaimed by moss, yet still unmistakable in geometry. He stopped just short of the perimeter and exhaled slowly, saying that it had grown back thicker than he expected, that time had softened the violence, but not erased the structure beneath it. Ethan asked quietly whether he would step inside, and Elias shook his head once, saying that he had made that mistake only once in the weeks after Daniel disappeared and had not crossed the boundary since. His refusal did not feel like superstition, but like respect. For a line drawn without signage, I felt a pull to enter again, to stand where the shell casings lay and measure the distance between past and present. But something in the air pressed against that impulse, a density that had not been present during our earlier visits. Lena's recorder began registering low-frequency tremors almost immediately, faint but consistent. And Ethan whispered that the temperature drop on the thermal display was abrupt along the far tree line, as if a larger mass were interrupting ambient readings beyond the first layer of trunks. Elias raised his hand slightly, signaling stillness without looking at us, and we froze instinctively, the forest holding its breath with us. Then from deeper within, the timber came a single knock, not loud, not aggressive, but clear and resonant, the sound carrying through wood older than any of our recorded histories. Elias closed his eyes briefly at that first strike, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. And when the second knock followed from a slightly shifted angle, he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if confirming a pattern he had heard before. The third knock completed the sequence from behind the basin, rather than within it, enclosing the space in a triangle that did not include us at the center, but placed us at the edge of something defined. Long ago, Ethan's camera captured the geometry of sound, even if it could not capture its source. Lena's waveform spiked with each impact, but no branches snapped, no underbrush thrashed, only the controlled assertion of presence. Elias spoke then, not loudly, not addressing us, but addressing the forest itself, saying that no one here intended to cut or break, that no machines would return, that we were listening, and the words felt less like plea and more like confirmation of terms. The silence that followed stretched thin and precise, and then from beyond the densest cluster of cedars, a shape shifted into partial view. Not stepping fully into open ground, but occupying enough vertical space to redefine scale, shoulders broad, posture upright, motion restrained, the distance too great for detail, yet close enough to eliminate doubt about height. Ethan's breath caught audibly, but he did not zoom in recklessly. Lena's recorder captured a low exhale that vibrated through the clearing like distant thunder, and Elias remained still. Eyes fixed, not challenging, not retreating, the moment balanced on a line thinner than logic prefers. And then, as if some internal threshold had been reached, the figure stepped backward once, weight transferring with measured control, dissolving into overlapping trunks without breaking the rhythm of the forest floor. No rush, no pursuit, only withdrawal consistent with choice. The tension in my chest released slowly, replaced not with relief, but with understanding, because what we had witnessed was not an ambush avoided, but a boundary reaffirmed. Elias lowered his gaze and said quietly that it remembered, not us specifically, but the pattern of intrusion, the sound of engines, the crack of gunfire, and that vigilance does not fade simply because time passes. Ethan finally exhaled and whispered that we had our proof. But the word proof felt insufficient, almost disrespectful, because what stood beyond those trees was not a specimen or a headline, but a participant in a history we had only begun to grasp. Lena removed her headphones slowly, eyes still on the tree line, and I realized that the question driving me back to this forest had shifted subtly yet profoundly. I had come seeking confirmation of what happened to Daniel, hoping to frame his disappearance within myth or accident. But standing at the edge of that basin with Elias beside me, and the memory of 3 deliberate knocks echoing through timber, I understood that his story was intertwined with something larger than a single night, something that did not attack blindly, but responded when patterns were broken. And as we stepped carefully away from the perimeter without crossing into the circle, leaving it intact this time, I felt the forest resume its layered sound gradually, birds returning in cautious increments, wind redistributing scent through needles and moss, the system recalibrating once more. And in that recalibration lay the quiet conclusion of this chapter. Not resolution, but recognition. Because whatever moved within these woods under the legend of Bigfoot had shown restraint where violence might have been easier, and that restraint implied intelligence sharpened by memory. As we turned back toward the path leading to the cabin, and eventually to our camp, Elias walking slightly ahead, I knew that the line had not been erased, only clarified, and that the next step we chose would determine whether this remained a negotiation of space or became the repetition of a mistake made 15 years earlier. The morning after we brought Elias back to the basin, the forest in Oregon felt deceptively calm, not welcoming, not hostile, but balanced in a way that suggested an agreement had been acknowledged without being spoken aloud. Ethan reviewed the footage repeatedly, isolating the frame where the silhouette held for that fraction of a second between the cedars, enlarging it until pixels blurred into abstraction, while Lena layered the audio from the 3 triangulated knocks beneath the low exhale we captured, building a composite that revealed pattern rather than spectacle. And I stood at the edge of camp staring toward the direction of the basin, aware that something fundamental had shifted the previous afternoon. Not in the forest alone, but within us, because restraint had been met with restraint, and that equilibrium felt fragile. Elias arrived shortly after sunrise, moving through the trees without announcement, his presence quieter than our equipment cases. He said little at first, only that the forest had been still through the night near his cabin. No knocks, no pacing, and that stillness carried weight equal to noise. We gathered near the cold fire pit and discussed whether to return immediately or allow space to widen between interactions. Ethan argued for documentation while the boundary was open, saying that we had a rare window of proximity without aggression. Lena remained silent, eyes distant, as if replaying the breath that rolled through the clearing. And I felt caught between urgency and caution. Daniel had likely stood in that same space 15 years earlier, facing similar pressure from men who believed delay meant weakness. And I understood now how easily curiosity turns into insistence. Elias listened to us debate, and then asked a single question that quieted the discussion. He asked whether we intended to step into the circle again, and the way he phrased it carried no accusation, only awareness that crossing that line would not be neutral. I admitted that part of me wanted to map the woven structure more precisely, to determine whether it had been rebuilt over time or remained as ruin, to see if the pattern of breaks suggested habitation or abandonment. Ethan nodded at that, adding that a detailed scan might clarify whether we were dealing with animal architecture or something more complex. Elias held my gaze and said that the last time machines entered that basin, they were not violent at first. They were curious, measuring, testing, and that escalation followed not from attack, but from refusal to withdraw. His words lingered in the air like a warning disguised as memory. And yet the pull toward the center persisted, not driven by thrill, but by the need to understand the geometry of what had been lost. Lena finally spoke, suggesting that if we returned, we should do so without floodlights, without drones, without any tool that hummed or cut, only cameras and recorders, mirroring the restraint shown to us. The compromise settled uneasily but definitively, and so by late morning the four of us walked once more toward the scar at the heart of the forest, the path now familiar enough to reduce disorientation, yet still layered with tension. Birds watched from higher branches, but did not scatter, the moss beneath our boots absorbing sound until our approach felt almost ghost-like. And when the basin emerged again between trunks, it appeared unchanged at first glance. The radial arrangement of fallen timber intact, the woven debris still collapsed at the center. But as we drew closer, a detail sharpened into focus that none of us had seen before. Along the inner perimeter of the circle, several saplings had been bent inward overnight. Not broken, not snapped, but flexed deliberately toward the center, their tips interlacing loosely above the moss. A subtle reconstruction forming where ruin had stood. Ethan whispered that it looked like reinforcement. Lena's recorder registered faint rustling, though no wind moved through the basin, and Elias inhaled slowly, saying that 15 years ago the woven structure had taken weeks to flatten completely under machines, and that rebuilding, if it occurred, would be patient rather than immediate. I stepped to the edge of the circle but did not cross, studying the bent saplings and the pattern they created. Not chaotic, not symmetrical either, but functional in a way that suggested shelter or boundary marker. And as I stood there absorbing the change, I felt the first ripple of doubt about our continued presence. Because if something was rebuilding, then something was investing effort. And effort implies intent. Ethan raised the camera cautiously to capture the new formation, while Lena angled her recorder toward the interior. And for a moment, the forest remained quiet enough to convince us that observation would not provoke response. Then from somewhere beyond the basin came a low, resonant knock, singular and deeper than the previous sequences. Not three this time, not triangulated, just one heavy impact that carried through the soil and into bone. Elias did not move, but I saw his jaw tighten, and I understood that the pattern had shifted again, no longer announcing or enclosing but asserting, and standing at the edge of a circle that showed signs of careful reconstruction. I realized that this was no longer simply about what had been destroyed 15 years ago. It was about what was being restored now, and restoration is far more fragile than ruin. The single knock did not echo twice. It did not complete a pattern. It simply settled into the basin like a stone dropped into still water. And in that absence of repetition, there was something more commanding than the triangulated signals of the nights before. Elias kept his gaze fixed on the bent saplings, forming that fragile inward arc, while Ethan slowly lowered the camera, as if sensing that amplification might fracture whatever equilibrium held. Lena's recorder trembled slightly in her hand, though she did not step back, and I stood at the threshold of the circle with the awareness that crossing it now would no longer be documentation, but intrusion into an active reconstruction. The air felt denser than on previous visits, not colder, not warmer, but compressed, as if the basin itself resisted disturbance, and for a moment no one spoke, because language felt too blunt for the precision of what was unfolding. Then Elias said quietly that when something rebuilds, it is testing whether the destruction has ended, and if it is interrupted again, the response will not mirror the first. His words carried no superstition, only observation layered by years of listening. Ethan asked whether we should withdraw immediately, but even as he spoke, another subtle change occurred along the inner perimeter. One of the bent saplings shifted slightly, not snapping, not recoiling, but adjusting, fibers tightening under unseen pressure. From deeper within the timber, Lena's display spiked with a low-frequency vibration that did not translate into audible sound, yet traveled through the soil into our stance, and I felt it in the arches of my feet. A transfer of weight somewhere beyond visible lines, deliberate and contained. Not a charge, but a repositioning, as if something had moved closer to the far side of the basin, without breaking the geometry of concealment. Ethan instinctively stepped back one pace, and I mirrored him. Not out of panic, but recognition that proximity itself might be the catalyst. Elias finally shifted his posture, placing himself slightly forward, yet still outside the circle, and spoke again into the open air, stating that we had seen the change and would not cross, that no cutting would follow, that no machines would return, his tone firm but not pleading. And for several seconds the forest held its layered quiet. Then from behind the densest cluster of cedars, a second knock landed, not aligned with the first direction, but offset by perhaps 30 degrees, establishing a new axis across the basin. Lena whispered that the spatial orientation had changed, that the signals were no longer enclosing camp but defining the circle itself. Ethan glanced at me with the unspoken question of whether we had already gone too far, and I realized that the boundary had evolved from warning to assertion. The bent saplings were not random regrowth, but deliberate redefinition, and our presence at the edge had interrupted a process in motion. I took a slow breath and stepped backward deliberately, increasing the distance between my boots and the mossed perimeter by several feet, signaling withdrawal not theatrically, but physically, and Elias followed without hesitation, Lena and Ethan matching the retreat until we stood among the outer trunks, no longer at the lip of the scar, but within the ordinary forest beyond it. The vibration subsided gradually, not vanishing but diminishing, and the tension in the air loosened just enough to suggest acknowledgement. Ethan lowered the camera entirely, lens pointing toward the ground rather than the basin, and Lena muted her recorder momentarily, an instinctive act of reducing intrusion, and in that collective reduction the forest resumed faint ambient sound. A bird call, tentative at first, then another farther away, the layered system recalibrating around our new distance. I felt a weight lift that I had not fully registered until it eased. Because what had been building in that basin was not aggression, but resistance to repetition. And repetition had nearly occurred when we approached too closely. Elias turned to me then and said that restoration is not a spectacle to be filmed, but a signal to be respected. And the gravity of that distinction settled over me more heavily than any thermal frame or audio spike, because the story I had come to document was no longer centered on what happened 15 years ago. It was centered on what might happen now if we insisted on proof rather than understanding. Ethan finally spoke, voice lower than usual, admitting that pushing further would shift us from observers to catalysts, and Lena nodded in agreement, her earlier tension replaced by something closer to resolve. And as we began walking away from the basin, without turning our backs too abruptly, I glanced once more at the inward bent saplings forming their fragile arc, and understood that the line had been redrawn, not through violence, but through reconstruction. A quiet, but firm declaration that whatever occupied this forest under the shadow of the legend of Bigfoot was not merely surviving the past, it was actively repairing it, and that repair demanded distance, not documentation. We did not return to camp immediately after leaving the basin. Instead, we stopped along a narrow ridge where the trees thinned just enough to allow filtered light to fall across moss like muted glass. And for the first time since entering the forest in Oregon, I felt the full weight of what restraint required. Ethan set the camera down without powering it off, as if uncertain whether the act of shutting it down entirely would symbolize retreat or wisdom. Lena sat on a fallen log, with her recorder resting idle in her lap, not capturing, not analyzing, simply present. And Elias remained standing, hands clasped loosely behind his back, listening to something beyond our range of hearing. The forest had resumed its layered rhythm, birds tentatively reclaiming airspace, wind redistributing scent and sound through the canopy. Yet beneath that surface balance lingered the memory of the single heavy knock and the second axis that followed, a redefinition of territory that did not rely on spectacle. I finally broke the silence by admitting that part of me still wanted to step into the circle again, not to disrupt, but to understand the pattern of the bent saplings, to measure the arc of reconstruction, to confirm whether what we were witnessing was habitation or boundary marking. And even as I spoke, I recognized the echo of the logging foreman in my reasoning. The subtle shift from curiosity to entitlement masked as documentation. Elias did not scold or argue. He simply said that understanding does not always require proximity. Sometimes it requires absence, and the simplicity of that statement unsettled me more than confrontation would have, because absence meant relinquishing control of the narrative, relinquishing the need to frame Daniel's disappearance within clean edges. Ethan finally turned off the camera with deliberate slowness, the small click of power down sounding louder than any knock we had heard. And in that gesture, there was acknowledgement that not every interaction must be archived to be real. Lena removed the batteries from her primary recorder and placed them carefully into her pocket, reducing the hum of circuitry between us and the forest. And as we sat there with less equipment mediating our senses, I became acutely aware of the subtler signals around us, the direction of wind, the micro shifts in underbrush, the faint but deliberate redistribution of presence deeper within the trees, not retreating fully but adjusting, maintaining distance equal to ours. The mirroring continued even without devices to measure it, and that reciprocity altered my understanding of the entire arc of events. 15 years ago, machines had entered without listening. Gunfire had followed without pause. Destruction had preceded comprehension. And now, standing on a ridge with Elias as witness, we were being offered an alternative pattern, one in which space was negotiated rather than seized. Ethan asked quietly whether leaving the basin undisturbed would truly prevent escalation, and Elias answered that nothing prevents conflict absolutely, but patterns can be shifted before they harden into repetition. Lena added that the 3 knocks had changed since our first night, evolving from enclosure to axis marking, and that evolution suggested adaptive behavior rather than fixed ritual. The term adaptive lingered between us with scientific gravity, because adaptation implies intelligence interacting with environment, and intelligence demands recognition rather than conquest. I felt Daniel's absence more sharply then, not as mystery, but as consequence. Perhaps he had reached this same understanding too late. Perhaps his second shot had been fired at the moment when withdrawal might have altered everything. And the thought carried no accusation toward him, only sorrow for timing. The forest around us seemed to breathe more evenly now, the earlier compression lifting incrementally. And as we finally rose to return toward camp, I made a decision that felt less like surrender and more like alignment. We would not re-enter the circle again during this season of filming. We would document from distance. We would observe reconstruction without measuring it. We would let the basin remain center, without insisting on standing within it. Ethan nodded in quiet agreement. Lena's expression softened with relief she did not voice, and Elias gave a single approving glance that carried more weight than overt praise. As we descended the ridge and the basin fell fully out of sight behind layered trunks, I realized that the story we were telling had shifted irrevocably. No longer a hunt for proof of Bigfoot, but an examination of how boundaries are drawn and redrawn between human intent and something older that resists erasure. And though the forest remained vast and largely unknowable, its response to our withdrawal had clarified one truth. Vigilance does not always manifest as violence. Sometimes it manifests as reconstruction, and whether we respected that reconstruction would determine what followed. By late afternoon, the light over the camp had shifted into that muted amber that filters through fir and cedar like memory rather than illumination. And the forest in Oregon felt balanced again, not empty, not permissive, but stable in a way that suggested a recalibration had completed. Ethan busied himself cataloging footage we had already gathered, careful not to frame the basin as conquest, but as context. Lena organized the audio files into sequences labeled by pattern, rather than spectacle. And Elias sat on a low stump near the perimeter, gaze directed toward the trees as if measuring something intangible beyond sight. None of us spoke for a while because what needed to be decided did not require debate. It required acceptance, and that acceptance settled slowly. Like fog returning after brief sun, I walked to the edge of camp and looked toward the corridor of darker trunks, where we had first sensed enclosure days earlier, remembering the triangulated knocks, the breath that vibrated through bone, the silhouette that stepped back rather than forward. And I understood that the narrative we had been building could fracture easily if we insisted on climax instead of comprehension. Ethan eventually joined me and said quietly that viewers would expect escalation, that withholding the center might feel incomplete, and I answered that incompleteness was the truest reflection of what we had encountered, because whatever moved within those woods under the long shadow of Bigfoot had demonstrated something rarer than aggression. It had demonstrated measured restraint in the face of intrusion. Lena approached then, holding a final playback of the heavy singular knock from earlier that day, the waveform thick and solitary, and she noted that its resonance carried deeper frequencies than the earlier triangulated pattern. As if the message had shifted from warning to declaration, Elias listened once and nodded, saying that declaration was not threat, but statement of presence. A line drawn not to invite conflict, but to prevent repetition, and as dusk settled without further signal, without pacing or breath or shifting shadow, the absence itself became meaningful. The forest no longer pressing at the perimeter of camp, no longer triangulating our position, simply existing beyond us in layered quiet. Ethan powered down the remaining cameras deliberately. Lena removed batteries from the last active recorder, and Elias rose slowly from the stump, brushing moss from his coat, saying that when vigilance does not escalate, it means the boundary has been respected for now. His use of the word now carried deliberate caution, because boundaries remain active, not fixed. And as the final light drained from the canopy and night reclaimed the clearing, I felt a profound shift within myself. I had returned to these woods seeking closure for Daniel, seeking confirmation that his disappearance could be explained by myth or miscalculation. But what I found instead was a pattern larger than a single event, a cycle of intrusion and correction that did not hinge on monsters or superstition, but on response. And standing there in the dim afterglow with the forest breathing evenly beyond our reach, I made a quiet promise not into a camera, but into the dark itself, that we would leave the circle intact, that we would not test reconstruction for proof, that our presence would not become the next escalation. The silence that followed was not empty but settled, layered with insects and distant wing beats, returning to ordinary rhythm. And in that restoration of ambient sound, I sensed acknowledgement rather than dismissal, not friendship, not alliance, but coexistence maintained through distance. Elias turned toward the path leading back to his cabin, and paused only long enough to say that the forest remembers patterns longer than men remember names. And then he disappeared between trunks without ceremony, leaving the three of us standing at the edge of our small clearing, aware that the line we had approached had not vanished, only clarified, and as night fully enveloped the camp without a single deliberate knock echoing through timber. I understood that this episode had not ended with confrontation, but with negotiation. A fragile equilibrium drawn across moss and memory, and whether it would hold depended entirely on whether we remembered the lesson written not in footprints or footage, but in the deliberate act of rebuilding what had once been broken. The morning after the forest chose silence felt heavier than any night filled with knocks, because quiet that follows negotiation carries uncertainty rather than peace. And as mist settled low across the clearing in Oregon, I realized that restraint does not erase consequence, it only delays it. Ethan was already awake, seated with his laptop balanced on a supply crate, reviewing a frame from the thermal anomaly near the basin where the silhouette had held just long enough to redefine scale. He had isolated the heat signature against ambient readings and adjusted contrast carefully, not to exaggerate, but to understand. Lena moved more slowly that morning, methodical but distant, cataloging audio while pausing frequently as if listening for something beyond circuitry. Elias had not come by at dawn as he had the previous day, and his absence carried a weight none of us voiced, because part of the fragile equilibrium depended on his presence, as witness and intermediary. I stepped toward the perimeter of camp and noticed immediately that the air felt different, not tense, not compressed, but unsettled, like a system recalculating after an interruption. Birds were present, yet restless, lifting and resettling repeatedly rather than maintaining steady perches. The moss beneath my boots felt damp beyond the usual moisture, as if the forest floor had absorbed more than rainfall overnight. Ethan called me over to the monitor and pointed to a segment recorded just before midnight, after we had powered down the primary cameras, but before he fully shut the secondary rig. The frame showed the outer edge of camp, empty at first glance, then a subtle shift in exposure as something passed between trunks just beyond the line of detection, not stepping into view but altering the infrared balance long enough to confirm mass. And what unsettled him most was the direction of movement, not circling camp as before, but moving parallel to it. Tracking the length of our clearing without attempting enclosure, Lena leaned closer and replayed the final seconds, noting that no knock accompanied the movement, no triangulated declaration, only silent pacing, and I felt the quiet weight of that adjustment, because silence can signal observation more intensely than warning. Daniel had written once that the most unnerving nights were those without knocks, when he sensed proximity, but heard nothing to anchor it. And as I replayed the footage, I recognized that we had crossed from negotiated distance into monitored presence. Elias arrived, mid-morning, slower than usual, and when he stepped into the clearing, his expression confirmed what the footage implied. He said the forest had not been still near his cabin, that sometime after midnight he heard a single heavy knock from deeper than usual. Not near the basin, but closer to the old logging road. The axis had shifted outward, and that shift carried implication. Ethan asked whether that meant the boundary was expanding, and Elias answered that expansion is not the right word, that when vigilance detects potential repetition, it widens its field of awareness. Lena asked whether our continued filming might be interpreted as that repetition, and Elias did not answer immediately, instead scanning the trees around camp before speaking, saying that restraint had been acknowledged. But restraint tested too frequently becomes pattern again, and pattern leads to correction. His phrasing felt less like warning and more like inevitability measured in increments. I told him about the silent pacing captured on thermal, and he nodded once, saying that once a boundary is clarified, it does not need constant announcement. Sometimes it is maintained quietly, and I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with responsibility, because our decision to remain even at distance was still presence. Still pressure applied to a system already strained once before. Ethan suggested we consider ending the expedition earlier than planned, preserving equilibrium before escalation forced it. Lena agreed quietly, but I hesitated, not from stubbornness, but from unresolved weight surrounding Daniel's final path. We had documented the basin, witnessed reconstruction, recorded triangulated assertion, and controlled withdrawal, yet we had not fully traced the route he might have taken on the night of the gunshots. The line between Circle and Logging Road remained partially unexamined. Elias watched me as I wrestled with that thought and said that if we intended to follow that route, we needed to do so with clarity about consequence, because revisiting the old machinery site would reopen the first scar, and scars remember contact. His words settled heavily in the clearing, and for several seconds no one spoke. The forest around us layered with normal sound, yet underscored by something unspoken. The silent pacing in the footage, the shifted knock near the logging road, the widened field of awareness, all converging into a single realization. We were no longer being warned about the Circle alone. We were being reminded that the entire corridor of intrusion remained active. And as I looked toward the direction of the abandoned road where Daniel's last known coordinates intersected with machinery and gunfire, I understood that the next decision would not test reconstruction. It would test memory itself. We left camp before noon with fewer words than usual, not because there was nothing to say, but because each of us understood that the path toward the old logging road was not neutral ground. It was the corridor, where machines had once entered the forest in Oregon, and where Daniel's final coordinates intersected with noise and disruption. Elias walked slightly behind us this time, not leading, not guiding, but observing, as though allowing us to choose the angle of approach without influence. Ethan carried only one primary camera, leaving the secondary rigs powered down, and Lena kept a single recorder active at low sensitivity, the reduction in equipment intentional, almost ceremonial. The forest along this route felt different from the basin, less dense, more scarred, tree spacing uneven where heavy tires had compacted soil years ago, moss thinner where sunlight reached ground too quickly after canopy was removed. And yet beneath those scars, life had returned in layered resilience, saplings rising from ruts once carved by steel, vines reclaiming rusted metal that lay half-submerged near the edge of the path. The air here carried a faint metallic scent beneath the usual damp earth, and as we approached the bend where Daniel's map marked his final deviation from the crew, I felt the pressure of repetition press against my ribs. This was not reconstruction territory. This was origin ground, the first fracture point. Ethan paused near a cluster of rotting timbers that once supported a loading platform, and he gestured toward the soil where irregular depressions remained preserved beneath new growth. Not clear footprints, but zones where weight had shifted earth abruptly and then been covered by seasons. Lena crouched to examine a patch where moss thinned unnaturally, and beneath it, she uncovered a small fragment of faded fabric caught against a splintered beam. Not fresh, not recent, but old enough to predate our arrival. I recognized the color immediately. A muted gray that matched the jacket Daniel wore in photographs from that week. The discovery did not explode into drama. It settled heavily, confirming that this was indeed the corridor he had followed. Elias stepped forward quietly and said that the crew reported Daniel running toward the basin after the second shot, not away from it. And that detail reframed the narrative entirely, because running toward rather than fleeing implies pursuit of something specific, not panic. Ethan adjusted his camera angle to capture the platform remains and the direction of the basin beyond it, narrating softly about the spatial relationship between machinery and circle, while Lena replayed a faint segment from the night we captured silent pacing, aligning it mentally with this geography, and I felt the pieces begin to form a pattern. Daniel confronting the crew at the machinery site, hearing the first knock from the basin, moving toward it rather than away, the second shot fired not at machinery, but perhaps between two lines of presence, and then silence swallowing everything. As we stood there, the forest seemed quieter than usual, not absent of sound, but narrowed, as if filtering out extraneous noise to focus on our movement along this corridor. A faint vibration passed through the ground again, weaker than the one near the basin, yet distinct enough to register. And Lena's recorder flickered with a low pulse. Ethan glanced toward the tree line bordering the old road, and whispered that the thermal readings were unstable at the far edge, not flaring like before, but shifting subtly, as though something large moved parallel beyond the visible trunks. No knock followed this time, no deliberate impact to mark distance, only the sensation of proximity adjusting to our path. Elias murmured that memory does not remain anchored to a single location, it travels the routes of disruption, and if we were retracing Daniel's steps, then vigilance would follow accordingly. I stepped closer to the platform remains and brushed aside loose bark from one of the beams, revealing another, spent casing wedged between cracks in the wood, older than the ones we found in the basin, its surface more weathered, suggesting it had fallen here before Daniel reached the circle. Ethan inhaled sharply at that detail, because it implied at least one shot had been fired near machinery before he ran deeper. And the narrative shifted again from sudden confrontation to progressive escalation. Lena whispered that if the first shot occurred here, then the corridor itself became part of the boundary, not just the basin. And as she spoke, a branch snapped somewhere beyond the tree line, not violently but with controlled pressure. The sound carried clearly through the thinning canopy. Ethan swung the camera instinctively, but did not zoom recklessly, and I felt the now familiar awareness of being tracked without enclosure. The pacing resumed quietly along the outer edge of the road, weight shifting through undergrowth in measured intervals, matching our steps, but not exceeding them. And in that mirrored motion lay the unmistakable message. We had stepped into the memory path, and memory does not remain passive when retraced. The snap of the branch did not repeat, yet the pacing beyond the tree line continued with that same deliberate restraint we had come to recognize. Not rushing, not retreating, but adjusting its distance in parallel with ours. And as we stood beside the rotting remains of the loading platform in Oregon, I felt the corridor tighten around us, without physically narrowing. Ethan kept the camera steady, resisting the urge to search wildly through foliage, while Lena angled the recorder toward the tree line where the movement registered strongest on her display. And Elias stepped closer to the beam where we found the weathered casing, kneeling carefully as though approaching a relic rather than debris. He ran his fingers just above the wood without touching it, and said that this was likely where the first shot was fired, not toward the basin, but toward the road, toward the machines, perhaps to stop them, or to create space between men and something advancing from the timber. The possibility shifted the narrative once again. Daniel may not have been reacting blindly, but attempting to halt escalation at its source. And if that was true, then the second shot near the basin had not initiated conflict but responded to it. The pacing in the trees slowed as if mirroring our stillness, and for a moment the forest felt suspended between past and present. Lena replayed the low-frequency pulse captured seconds earlier and aligned it with our current position on the map, whispering that the signal was stronger here than near the basin, as though the corridor retained imprint. Ethan glanced at me and said quietly that if we continued toward the exact coordinates of Daniel's last transmission, we would be walking directly through the line between machinery and circle. And I knew he was right. This was the path Daniel had chosen. Not away from disturbance, but through it, toward the center of conflict. Elias rose slowly from his crouch and said that retracing is not the same as repeating, but only if intention differs. His words settled into the air like a measured caution, and after a long pause I nodded and stepped forward along the old road, boots pressing into soil once compacted by heavy tires, moss thinning beneath my weight. Where the ground remembered pressure, Ethan followed with camera lowered, Lena just behind him, Elias last, and as we advanced, the pacing resumed again beyond the trees, closer now, yet still contained, weight transferring through brush without reckless noise. And I understood that whatever moved alongside us was not surprised by this route. It was familiar with it, perhaps more familiar than we were, because it had traversed this corridor in the aftermath of gunfire and engine noise 15 years earlier, halfway along the bend where the road curved toward the basin. The air shifted abruptly, cooler, denser, and a single low exhale rolled through the undergrowth to our right. Not a roar, not aggressive, but unmistakably close. Ethan stopped instantly, camera trembling slightly before steadying. Lena's recorder spiked with a waveform larger than any we had captured outside the basin. And Elias did not step back, instead raising one hand slowly in a gesture of acknowledgement rather than defense. I felt the pressure of proximity settle into my chest, not suffocating, but undeniable. And in that moment, the difference between basin and corridor crystallized. The basin was reconstruction. The corridor was memory, and we were standing within the latter, where the first fracture occurred. The pacing halted entirely, replaced by stillness so complete that even insects seemed to mute themselves. And I sensed that the next decision would define whether this remained observation or shifted toward repetition. Ethan whispered that we were within 20 yards of the last transmission coordinate, and Lena confirmed softly, her voice barely audible. And I realized that Daniel had likely stood somewhere within this invisible ring of trees when he chose to move toward the basin, perhaps hearing the same exhale, feeling the same measured proximity, and whatever decision he made then had shaped everything that followed. I took a slow breath and lowered my gaze briefly, not in surrender, but in recognition, and spoke quietly into the trees, stating that we would not fire, that no machines would follow us, that we were here to understand the path, not to alter it. The words felt fragile yet necessary, and after several seconds that stretched almost beyond endurance, the weight in the underbrush shifted, not toward us, but diagonally away, creating a gap in presence that opened like a door left ajar, rather than forced wide. The pacing resumed at greater distance, parallel but no longer pressing close, and the air eased fractionally, not relaxed, but recalibrated. Ethan exhaled audibly. Lena lowered the recorder slightly, and Elias murmured that the corridor had been acknowledged, not contested. And as we stood at the edge of Daniel's last known position, I understood that the forest was not reliving the past blindly. It was testing whether we would. And in that test lay the fragile line between remembrance and repetition. We stood there for several seconds after the weight in the underbrush shifted away, the corridor stretching before us like a line drawn between past and present. And for the first time since returning to Oregon, I felt the full gravity of Daniel's final decision settle into my body not as mystery, but as proximity. Ethan slowly lowered the camera until it rested against his chest, no longer framing the tree line, but absorbing the fact that we were standing within the last coordinates of a moment that fractured more than one life. Lena kept the recorder active, but reduced sensitivity, no longer seeking amplification, only documentation of ambient recalibration. And Elias remained still, gaze moving not with anxiety but with long familiarity along the outer edge of the road where memory and vigilance seemed to overlap. The forest around us resumed layered sound cautiously. A distant bird call, the faint scrape of bark adjusting under its own weight. Yet beneath that surface rhythm lingered the unmistakable awareness of presence farther out, parallel to us, but no longer pressing close. And I understood then that the exhale and diagonal withdrawal had not been concession, but assessment completed. The corridor had been retraced without escalation, and that difference altered the entire arc of the story. I stepped forward one final pace to the exact point where Daniel's signal had cut off years ago and knelt, brushing aside moss and loose needles, not searching for remains or relics, but grounding myself in the physical space he once occupied. The soil here felt compacted differently than surrounding ground, as if weight had shifted abruptly and then settled. Ethan moved beside me but did not film. Lena watched silently, and Elias spoke in a low, steady voice, saying that sometimes disappearance is not eradication, but removal from repetition. That what remains is the lesson embedded in the pattern. And his phrasing carried no mysticism, only observation shaped by time. I realized that Daniel may have stepped toward the basin not to chase myth, but to interrupt escalation, to prevent machines from advancing further into reconstruction. And if that was true, then his final act had not been curiosity, but restraint. Attempted too late, the forest seemed to breathe more evenly now. No knocks, no pacing, only distance maintained with precision. And in that maintained distance, I felt the weight of choice settle fully upon me. Ethan finally spoke, voice quieter than I had ever heard it, saying that we had enough, that pushing beyond this point would not clarify the past but risk reactivating it. Lena nodded in agreement, her expression steady rather than fearful, and Elias gave a single approving glance that confirmed what the forest had already indicated. The boundary here was not to be crossed again. Not physically, not symbolically. I rose slowly and looked once more toward the tree line where the exhale had emerged, sensing that whatever moved within those layers of cedar and fir was still present, still vigilant, but no longer tightening the corridor around us. And in that measured distance lay the resolution of this chapter. Not closure, but recognition. Because the forest had not responded with violence when we retraced the path. It had responded with calibrated proximity, and that calibration was the clearest message of all. As we turned back toward camp, the pacing resumed at far greater distance, barely perceptible now, more suggestion than signal. And I understood that the story of Big Fut within these woods was not about spectacle or capture, but about boundaries negotiated across years, boundaries that remember sound and weight and repetition. And as the old logging road faded behind us beneath moss and returning life, I felt the line between intrusion and understanding settle into place. Daniel's path had been retraced without gunfire, without machinery, without forcing entry into the circle again. And that difference mattered more than any frame of thermal distortion, because escalation had not been repeated. And in a forest that corrects pattern rather than indulges it, breaking the cycle may be the only form of truth it recognizes. The final morning in Oregon arrived without spectacle, no mist rolling dramatically through trunks, no echoing knocks to mark departure. Only a steady gray light filtering through canopy, as if the forest preferred conclusions to unfold quietly rather than announced. Ethan was already dismantling one of the camera mounts when I stepped from the tent. His movements slower than earlier in the week, deliberate, almost reflective. Lena sat near the edge of camp with the recorder in her hands, but powered off, as if listening without needing confirmation from circuitry. And Elias had not yet appeared from the direction of his cabin, though I sensed he was aware of our timeline without needing to be told. The clearing felt different that morning, not emptied but resolved, like a room after a difficult conversation where no agreement is spoken, yet understanding lingers in the air. I walked toward the corridor that led to the old logging road and paused, not expecting movement, but feeling the weight of memory embedded in soil and root. The path we had retraced yesterday no longer pressed inward with presence, no pacing beyond the tree line, no vibration beneath the moss, and that absence carried clarity rather than tension, because what needed to be communicated along that route had already been conveyed. Ethan approached quietly and asked whether I wanted to take one final walk toward the basin before we left. Not to enter, not to measure, just to look from distance. And I considered the suggestion carefully, understanding the instinct to confirm equilibrium before departure. Lena joined us and said softly that the audio from the previous night had been completely ordinary. Insects, distant owl, no low-frequency pulses at all, and her tone suggested that ordinariness was not disappointing, but reassuring. Elias emerged from the trees then, stepping into the clearing without sound. His expression calm, but weighted with something close to closure. He said that the forest had been still near his cabin, not silent in suppression, but silent in balance, and that balance should not be tested twice in the same way. His phrasing echoed through me with quiet authority, because throughout this week, the forest had responded not with chaos, but with adjustment, triangulating when we pressed, retreating when we withdrew, rebuilding when we allowed space. And now, in this final morning light, it seemed to rest, not because it trusted us, but because the pattern had shifted sufficiently to avoid correction. We gathered near the center of camp and discussed what would remain unseen in our footage. The bent saplings inside the circle that we chose not to measure again, the diagonal withdrawal along the corridor that prevented repetition, the single heavy knock that declared reconstruction without aggression. Ethan admitted that viewers might crave clearer images, a sharper silhouette, definitive proof framed in contrast, and I answered that clarity is not always a gift. Sometimes it is an intrusion. Lena nodded and added that the most consistent pattern we documented was restraint, and that restraint deserved to be honored rather than exploited. Elias listened and then said quietly that stories about Bigfoot often fail because they chase confrontation, when what remains in these woods survives precisely by avoiding it. His words did not romanticize the presence we encountered. They grounded it in pattern and memory. And as we began dismantling the final pieces of camp, I felt a shift within myself that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with responsibility. I had returned, seeking an answer to Daniel's disappearance, expecting either myth or miscalculation. But what I found instead was a system that responds to intrusion in calibrated measure. And that response reframed his final path, not as foolishness, but as timing, misaligned with consequence. The clearing gradually emptied of equipment, tents folded, cases sealed, the space reverting to open moss and fallen needles, And with each item removed, the air seemed lighter, less mediated by our presence, as if the forest preferred absence to acknowledgement. Ethan loaded the final case into the vehicle parked along the overgrown road. Lena stood at the edge of camp one last time with eyes closed, listening without device. And I took a final look toward the direction of the basin, not expecting movement, not demanding sign, simply recognizing that what lay there did not require our validation to exist. The forest remained vast, layered, and unbothered by our departure, yet aware enough to adjust when necessary. And as the engine turned over softly and we prepared to leave the clearing behind, I understood that the conclusion of this journey would not be defined by what we captured on screen, but by what we chose not to disturb. Because sometimes the only way to end a story without repeating it is to step back before the boundary demands correction again. We did not drive away immediately after loading the last case. Instead, the engine idled softly at the edge of the overgrown road, as if even the vehicle sensed that departure required more than ignition. The forest in Oregon stood layered and indifferent beyond the windshield. Yet I felt no indifference in return, only a quiet gravity that had settled over the past days. Ethan checked the mirrors as though expecting movement between trunks, not from paranoia, but from habit, formed by pacing shadows and thermal distortions. Lena reviewed one final audio file through her headphones, confirming again that the previous night held nothing but ordinary nocturnal life, and that ordinariness felt like the most deliberate signal of all. Elias stood a few yards from the road, hands resting loosely at his sides, not waving, not offering farewell in dramatic fashion, simply present as witness to our exit, the way he had been witness to the logging crews years before. I stepped out of the vehicle once more and walked toward him, not to ask permission, but to acknowledge the shared boundary that had held. He said quietly that leaving while the pattern is calm is wiser than waiting for it to sharpen again. And I knew he was not speaking only of the forest, but of memory itself, because staying too long inside a scar invites repetition. We stood there in a silence that did not demand words, wind sliding through upper branches in steady rhythm, and then from deeper within the timber, far beyond basin and corridor, came a single faint knock, not heavy, not close, but audible enough to register through the filtered air. Ethan's head lifted instantly from inside the vehicle. Lena removed her headphones slowly, and I felt the sound settle into my chest without tightening it. It was not enclosure, not triangulation, not assertion of axis. It was singular and distant, as if marking departure rather than warning arrival. Elias closed his eyes briefly and nodded once, murmuring that sometimes the forest marks endings as clearly as beginnings. I did not respond verbally, because the knock did not feel like invitation or threat, only acknowledgement that movement had occurred and would be remembered. The engine's low vibration contrasted against the natural stillness, and for a moment the mechanical hum sounded intrusive again, a reminder of what once entered in greater force. I climbed back into the driver's seat and eased the vehicle forward slowly, gravel crunching under tires in restrained cadence, careful not to accelerate abruptly as though speed might translate into provocation. The trees parted gradually along the narrow road, sunlight flickering through gaps in the canopy, and in the rearview mirror the clearing disappeared behind layers of cedar and fir without spectacle. No silhouette stepping into open ground, no pacing shadow trailing our departure. only the steady restoration of ordinary forest rhythm. Lena finally spoke in a soft voice, saying that the last knock carried lower resonance than the ones near camp, as if delivered from greater distance, and Ethan replied that it might simply have been wood settling in morning heat. But his tone lacked conviction, not because he believed more deeply, but because explanation had become secondary to pattern. I realized then that the story we would bring back from these woods would frustrate those seeking certainty, because certainty demands capture, and capture demands crossing. And crossing had already proven to invite correction, as the logging road merged into a wider path and eventually into pavement. The density of the forest thinned gradually. Yet I carried with me the unmistakable awareness that what we left behind did not diminish in absence. Vigilance does not require constant announcement, and reconstruction does not cease when observers depart. It continues quietly, within boundaries. We learned not to press again. Ethan turned off the last active monitor. Lena removed her headphones and set them aside, and the vehicle moved fully into open light beyond the heavy canopy. But even as distance widened between us and the basin, I understood that departure was not escape from mystery. It was alignment with pattern, and the faint, single knock that marked our leaving did not echo as warning, but as confirmation that the line had been respected for now. As the pavement replaced gravel and the dense walls of cedar and fir receded into a layered green horizon behind us, I felt no triumph in departure, no sense of escape from something pursued, only a quiet recognition that the forest in Oregon had allowed us to enter, adjust, and leave without demanding correction. And that allowance carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Ethan drove, in measured silence, his usual analytical commentary absent, hands steady on the wheel as though speed itself required moderation. After days spent negotiating invisible lines, Lena rested her forehead lightly against the window, eyes unfocused, not from exhaustion, but from inward recalibration. And I sat in the passenger seat, replaying the sequence not in frames but in pattern. Triangulated knocks marking enclosure, singular heavy strikes redefining axis, bent saplings signaling reconstruction, silent pacing along the corridor, diagonal withdrawal when intention shifted, and finally the distant single knock that marked departure without threat. The progression was not random. It was adaptive, responsive to our proximity and restraint. And in that adaptation lay the truth that resisted spectacle, because spectacle demands climax, while pattern demands comprehension. Daniel's final week replayed in my memory, not as tragedy isolated in darkness, but as a moment when pattern hardened too quickly, machines pressing deeper without pause, gunfire splitting layered silence, reaction misread as aggression rather than correction. And standing within that corridor days earlier, I had sensed how easily we might have repeated his timing had we insisted on proof instead of distance. Ethan eventually broke the silence by saying that audiences would expect an image, something definitive to anchor the narrative. And I answered that what we encountered does not belong to anchors, it belongs to boundaries. And boundaries are not captured cleanly in high contrast. They are negotiated through choice, Lena added softly, that the clearest evidence we gathered was behavioral, not visual, a system that escalated only when pressed and recalibrated when given space. And as she spoke, I realized that our footage would not show a creature in sharp relief. but it would reveal a logic in motion, a logic that remembered intrusion and adjusted accordingly. The highway stretched ahead in long, unbroken lines, yet my thoughts remained within the mossed circle and the old loading platform where the first shot was likely fired. Daniel may have believed that stepping toward the basin would diffuse the fracture, but timing and pressure had already crossed the threshold of restraint, and the forest responded in kind. Not with chaos, but with removal from repetition. Whether that removal meant death or displacement remained unknowable. Yet what became clear was that pattern does not seek revenge. It seeks balance, and balance sometimes requires subtraction. Ethan glanced at me briefly and said that he no longer viewed the silhouette frame as proof of myth, but as evidence of restraint. Something that could have closed distance and did not, and that decision, whatever intelligence guided it, carried more significance than capture would have. Lena nodded and said that the low-frequency pulses along the corridor resembled echo rather than attack, as if the ground itself remembered weight shifting along that path years earlier. And I felt the final layer of the story settle into place. This was never about confirming the existence of Bigfoot in the abstract. It was about understanding how systems older than human mapping respond to disruption, how vigilance manifests as calibrated distance rather than reckless force, and how crossing lines repeatedly hardens response into correction. The forest we left behind would continue its reconstruction, regardless of our narrative. Saplings bending inward to reform shelter. Moss thickening over metal remnants of machinery. Birds reclaiming airspace once fractured by engines. And somewhere within that layered canopy a presence would remain, not in pursuit, but in maintenance, adjusting when necessary, withdrawing when respected. And as the miles widened between us and the basin, I understood that closure was not the correct word for what we carried. It was alignment. We had entered seeking explanation and left recognizing pattern. And in recognizing it, we altered the trajectory of repetition. Ethan eventually turned on the radio at low volume, filling the cabin with distant human noise that felt almost foreign after days of layered forest rhythm. Lena closed her eyes briefly, perhaps hearing beneath the music the faint memory of 3 deliberate knocks, spaced in measured cadence, and I looked out at the thinning tree line, knowing that what we encountered would resist simplification, because it was not designed for human narrative arcs. It was designed for continuity, for survival through adaptation and restraint. And if there was a final lesson embedded in the moss and timber of those woods, it was this: that intelligence does not always announce itself with dominance. Sometimes it reveals itself in what it chooses not to do, and by leaving before forcing the boundary to sharpen again. We may have broken a cycle that began 15 years ago with noise and gunfire, not by conquering mystery, but by stepping back from it. By the time the forest line had dissolved fully into distant hills behind us, I understood that endings are rarely marked by spectacle. They are marked by restraint, held long enough to avoid repetition. And as the miles widened between our vehicle and the basin hidden deep within Oregon, I felt not distance from what we encountered, but clarity about it. Ethan eventually turned the radio off again, saying the noise felt intrusive after days of calibrated silence, and the hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm that no longer felt like invasion but transit. Lena reviewed nothing now. No audio files, no thermal stills, her recorder stored away, because what mattered most had already occurred in moments we chose not to amplify. Elias had remained behind in the timber without ceremony, a quiet witness resuming his place along the boundary. And I found myself thinking that perhaps every system requires someone who listens without needing proof, someone who understands that vigilance does not demand exposure to exist. Daniel had likely stood at the edge of that same realization too late, caught between machinery and reconstruction. And while his fate remained unresolved in tangible terms, the pattern surrounding it had clarified. Intrusion followed by correction, escalation followed by removal. And if our return had threatened to harden that pattern again, our withdrawal had softened it before it could repeat. Ethan spoke finally in a measured tone, saying that whatever we present must avoid framing the forest as adversary, because adversary invites challenge, and challenge invites repetition. Lena added that the most significant footage we captured was not the silhouette or the low-frequency pulses, but the moments where nothing happened after we stepped back. The absence of knock when we respected distance. The silence that followed our refusal to cross the circle again. And I nodded, realizing that the story we carried was not one of conquest or even confirmation, but of boundary recognized in time. As the highway carried us farther from the dense canopy, I replayed in my mind the single faint knock that marked our departure, distant and unhurried. Not a warning, not an enclosure, but a measured acknowledgement that movement had occurred. And in that acknowledgement, I sensed something older than legend, something that does not belong solely to tales of Bigfoot, but to the deeper rhythm of systems that adapt when pressed and stabilize when respected. The forest had not demanded tribute, it had demanded pattern shift. And when that shift occurred, it recalibrated instead of retaliating. That distinction reshaped everything I believed about Daniel's final night, because perhaps he had attempted the same shift under greater pressure, and timing alone separated correction from catastrophe. As open sky replaced tree line entirely, and the landscape broadened into ordinary horizon, I felt the weight of the journey settle into something steady rather than unresolved. We had entered a scar, traced its origin, witnessed reconstruction, and left before forcing the boundary to sharpen again. And that sequence mattered more than any frame of proof could, because what remains in those woods does not seek exposure. It seeks equilibrium. And equilibrium was preserved not through dominance, but through distance. The vehicle continued forward into widening light. And for a moment I imagined the basin behind us, quiet beneath layered canopy, saplings bending inward in patient arcs, moss reclaiming metal remnants of intrusion, and somewhere within that layered green a presence maintaining vigilance, not out of hatred, but memory. And as the final miles carried us fully away from the shadowed corridor, I understood that the story does not end in capture or revelation. It ends in choice. The choice to leave the circle intact. The choice to step back before correction becomes necessary. And in that choice lies the only resolution the forest recognizes. Not victory, not defeat, but balance restored. For now.